We're now reaching the last part of the lecture, and I wanted to also take the time to stress some of the challenges that remain for the coming decade. It's always good, obviously, to stress the successes that we've had and the way UDL is particularly powerful to frame our efforts, current efforts towards inclusion in post-secondary. But it also would not be realistic to not look at some of the difficulties that are inherent with regards to the implementation of UDL in post-secondary. It comes with its challenges. So the first one is documenting success and building collective experimentation body of literature with regards to implementation. Something which I find slightly concerning is that there's been hyper-fragmentation of efforts around UDL, even if you look at countries individually, so let's say Canada or the US or Ireland. And because of the way we function in I would say, in a hyper-competitive neoliberal environment where campuses are really fighting for visibility, market share, we tend to work in silos rather than work in a collaborative way across the sector. And that's, I think it's an assertion that's easy to make. So I think because of that climate, what we see internationally is many campuses within each jurisdictions of the global north, going through processes that are very similar. And instead of learning from one another, they tend to sort of reinvent the wheel. So what we're seeing is a lot of duplication of very similar processes of early implementations that are being, instead of being cloned, because they could be, a campus starting this now could clone a campus that has already been going at it for 5 years, but we're not seeing that. We're really seeing initiatives, community of practice, individual educators who are starting from scratch and reinventing the wheel and rebuilding the whole first stage of the implementation process. And that's a little worrying because I think we are going to run out of steam. It's a long process, and if each campus decides to reinvent the wheel in terms of UDL implementation, I think it'll be very difficult for us to grow beyond a certain level of development and implementation. So what I would encourage, and this is a collective call to all of you as participants, because if you're watching this lecture, is that you are interested in UDL implementation, is to really encourage you to publish evidence of your efforts, particularly if they concern that whole first stage, which is really the curiosity stage, right? Professional development for faculty, spreading UDL across departments and faculties, and so forth. So that is really a body of literature that should be collective and shared. And we're not seeing that happen. My next heading is urgency in exploring UDL in specific contexts. I've already spoken about this a little bit in the previous section. So we do have some striking successes in new areas of UDL implementation, but we need to see a lot more of those. And so I've highlighted a few things here: language classrooms, science labs, field placement, experiential setting. I would add to that if medical schools, law schools, which we're only seeing take a tiny little toe, put a tiny little toe into this field. Management, for some reason, although social sciences have been pretty good at implementing UDL and exploring it, faculties of management tend to be, strikingly absent from all this course. So these are settings that are different in both the format of the space, often the format of the interaction with the learner, not lecture style, but with other interactions. Often content specific. I'm thinking, as I've mentioned before, that I've worked with a Canadian art school which was looking at how UDL might be useful in studio work and studio critique, particularly when students meet once a week and display their work and then work around a collective critique. There's a lot of work there which is about dribbling down those principles to very specific contexts, and we need to see that happen. Because that is what's going to be reassuring for faculty. We are in a little bit of a catch-22 situation where a lot of departments, a lot of faculty will refuse to take a step towards UDL unless there's evidence-based literature that shows the usefulness of UDL in their specific discipline and their specific setting. But unless people start using UDL and documenting their efforts, there will not be a literature that is appearing as being evidence-based that allows others to feel more courageous and supported in their work. So it's important to break that catch-22 and to each make sure in our own institutions that if you see practitioners that are actually experimenting in one of these innovative contexts, make sure that they publish their work and make sure that they contribute in this way to a collective understanding, or even a collective international understanding of the way UDL can translate, be implemented, dribble down into very specific contexts, very specific formats of teaching. The next heading is the need for core objectives analysis as a precondition to UDL implementation. That's very important. My experience working with faculty and supporting faculty has been that it is very difficult to engage in an authentic and rich discussion around universal design for learning implementation if a faculty member or an instructor is still battling with what exactly are the core outcomes of the course and what exactly is being assessed, particularly when it comes to assessment. This is a real hurdle. And I would say that this has nothing to do with UDL. It's just that the space for this discussion cannot happen before those questions have been clearly delineated and answered. Often, when one begins talking about UDL to faculty who have never used UDL, they become very, very worried that everything is up for grabs and that you're going to require flexibility with regards to everything. In fact, that's not the case. It is totally justifiable for a program or a course, an instructor to have very explicit course outcomes, and for those course outcomes to explicitly include very specific, and so I'm using specific a lot, but specific skills that need to be demonstrated, obviously learned and demonstrated. It's perfectly okay for an instructor to say that there's no leeway for flexibility with regards to these core outcomes, core skills to be demonstrated. But it does mean that there's going to be flexibility for everything else. And that clarity is required before you can have the discussions about everything else and injecting flexibility into everything else. So this is a reflection I found a lot of colleagues are returning to, is that it is very difficult for a faculty to engage, a faculty or instructor or department or school to engage in a reflection around UDL inclusion if they have not had this sort of foundational reflection and questioning around with precision about the actual nature of the outcomes of the course or the program and the skills being assessed. Once that happens, I find that the rest of the discussions are fairly easy to carry out, and that UDL fits particularly well into the sort of the repercussions of those discussions. So I put that as a heading because I think for a lot of campuses and a lot of departments, this is a part of the reflection, and that you will be unable to move further with UDL unless that reflection actually does happen. My next heading is need for a solid scholarship around management of change, and I think this is very important. I keep coming back to this in my own writing. I think in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of foundational work done in post-secondary education with regards to UDL. I would say that this answered and addressed the first need, which was curiosity, exploration. What is UDL? Why is it useful? How does it contribute to student outcomes? Why is it a preferable approach to inclusion than an accommodations-based approach? That has been well done, and there's quite a body of literature there. It would be wrong to stop there and think that the battle is won, because that really is only the first stage of full implementation. The second stage is to go beyond that once you've showed and demonstrated the pedagogical benefits of implementing UDL, but you actually need to acknowledge the fact that universities are very complex and large environments, and that the process of management of change doesn't happen overnight, but sort of process of wishful thinking. It has to be proactively designed. You have to think of factors of resistance. You have to erode these factors of resistance. You have to monitor and support the change process, and then you have to debrief and at the end evaluate if it's been completed or further work needs to be done. We have a particularly poor history in education institutions with regards to doing this process management of change successfully. Industry takes this very seriously. We do fall victim of that sort of wishful thinking that, okay, it needs to happen, that's it, it's in policy, it's going to happen, and that process of change often is not supported. If you look back, you can see that this is the case for integration of technology. You can certainly think of 2 or 3 examples there where we've sort of said that's it, that needs to happen. And inclusion is one of the fields where we've sort of come up with policies and mission statements, but we haven't always backed it up with a scrupulous sort of process of management of change and monitoring of management of change. So again, this is a call for action. I think if you are a scholar working in UDL, I think the time has come now to shift away from just talking about the benefits, the educational benefits of UDL, and it's now time to handhold institutions as they reflect on the process of management of change from a strategic point of view. And this has nothing to do with the actual principles or the content of those and the values that are being discussed. It's just, once you've agreed that inclusive design is important in establishing inclusion, well, how do you get people to shift to inclusive design from a cultural, organizational culture perspective and changing mindset? So a lot of work to be done there. I tend to keep coming back to the notion of ecological theory. I think we need theory to frame that process management of change. I'm particularly interested to ecological theory. It's been in education for a long time in terms of looking at the child at Bronfenbrenner's view, looking at the child in the middle of all these systems. Then we've extended that and looked at the educator in the middle of all these systems. In fact, we know we could really use ecological theory in any setting and just put the individual at the center and look at all the systems that are around them and that interact. But I would go further and say that now we have a more and more interest in looking at ecological theory within organizational change. And particularly for us in UDL, it's important to put the unit that is taking charge of UDL implementation at the center of that schematic representation. Then you're able to see the relationship which that unit has with other units in the campus. Those relationships often are very complex, and they will have a direct impact on the success the unit has in promoting UDL. So I'm really drawn to the use of ecological theory, but that's my personal note. But regardless of what you choose in terms of theory, I think it's very important that we see a body of literature around the strategic implementation of UDL start to take shape. That's going to be very important. Otherwise, we are likely to stall. What you're seeing at the moment is a lot of institutions who have been at it for 5 to 10 years, fairly successful in developing communities of practice or encouraging individual instructors to model UDL and spread the word. But you're going to find it very hard to move from there to cross-campus systemic and systematic sort of implementation if we don't have, again, that body of literature to support that process. Because senior administration will ask for that. They will ask for literature, evidence-based literature that supports that process. And so it's very important that we document everything and that we start producing that. I then had, let me see what I had as another setting. Top-down or bottom-up, that's a sort of spin-off from the previous subheading. When I work as a consultant, this is a question I'm asked very often. Looking at the future, a lot of institutions wonder whether they should privilege one or the other. I think it does not matter that much. I think it is a choice that will have to be looked at in context, depending on the history of your institution, the size of your institution, its market, its historical culture, its organizational structure. And so in the same way that within a classroom we say one size does not fit all, I would go micro scale and say even in UDL implementation, one size does not fit all. And what I encourage institutions to do is to go back to a sort of blueprint, and before they throw themselves into the deep end and start doing UDL implementation, that they carry out again this ecological mapping and see where they're at and how all of these variables are going to actually affect the way they implement UDL. That's where you may decide whether you prefer a top-down or bottom-up approach. And I think those decisions only make sense in context. And this solution may work from one campus and not for the other. It will be successful if it addresses the variables that you are actually identify at the blueprint level when looking at strategic expansion. 2 more points. I think it's also important looking at the next 10 years that we have an in-depth reflection around ownership of the model and responsibility for implementation. So far, we have seen accessibility services lead the way because it was assumed that UDL was mostly beneficial to students with disabilities and their inclusion. Therefore, it would fall to accessibility services to be the advocates on campus. It doesn't work at all, and I speak with experience, having had that role within a campus for 4 years as director of accessibility and trying to promote UDL. There's too much ambivalence within accessibility services with regards to UDL, because it promotes a social model of disability and practices that dribble from there. Usually, accessibility services are deeply anchored in a medical model approach. Their funding is also sort of grounded in a medical model approach. You're going to find it very, very difficult for them to actually promote social model, for promote UDL. They will do it. They will, so they play lip service, but it's not going to go far because I think their heart's not in the right place, and it's not an issue with their intentions. It's just that the structural, even the history, right, and the structure of these services is just, it leads to the opposite of what we want to achieve with UDL in every respect. So really, when accessibility services promote UDL implementation, they are in constant clash with their own sort of systems and their own operations. So it's going to be problematic. We've also seen in this lecture that UDL really isn't just about students with disabilities. It actually benefits all diverse learners, and we've seen that actually those diverse learners now make up easily for the majority of the students that's actually in our institutions. Therefore, we are going to need to involve support services that address the needs of international students, of indigenous students, of non-traditional students, of racialized students, of LGBTQ2S+ students, of students facing socioeconomic challenges, and so on and so forth. And therefore, it could really be any of these units rather than accessibility services. Now, obviously, they may not have the expertise in UDL, and it still may be the accessibility services that are the most expertise. But I think the model that we're likely to see ourselves shift to is an interdisciplinary model where really, instead of being a unit that's responsible for the drive for implementation or that has ownership over that model within that campus, what we're likely to see, and hopefully we'll see, is teams that are interdisciplinary and that actually carry that envelope and that are made up of stakeholders from all of these units that are affected by diversity and inclusion. And so I'm hoping that we see more and more of these sort of committee approach, where it's a round table and you actually have the voice of all the stakeholders involved that are present there, and that all of these diverse learners are represented in that group. Finally, my last point was creating a common discourse on campus. It was the title of the lecture. Again, if we do reach that level of sort of interdisciplinary model where the stakeholders that are involved in the inclusion of all of these diverse the groups of diverse learners are present at that round table and are actually involved in the promotion and development of universal design for learning, what we also need to see in the next decade that accompanies that move is that we need to change the discourse of UDL. Obviously, UDL has been heavily formulated with students with disabilities in mind. And so each of us within our institutions are going to have to actually go through a lot of the material that has been produced, a lot of the literature that has been produced, and actually to tweak in places this sort of default mechanism that we have, which is to always talk about students with disabilities when we talk about UDL inclusion, and to actually tweak this so that UDL can really become a common discourse that is shared by all. So that, for example, someone supporting international students feels very comfortable using it because it's relevant to them, that someone supporting racialized students from a widening participation sort of position also feels very comfortable with that vocabulary. So basically what I'm talking about is we have to extract UDL out of the field of disability and impairment, and to really position it in the way it's formulated, the way it's presented, so that it appeals to all of the stakeholders that are actually key in its future development within our campuses. And if we succeed in doing that and placing these stakeholders at the table, I'm very confident that it will become, as was stated in the title of this lecture, a common discourse within our campuses for the development of inclusion. So thank you very much for having attended the lecture and for perusing this site. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to contact me, and I'd be happy to continue that discussions virtually. Bye for now.